Good afternoon, friends, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to this webinar by AEA, where you really get to experience the full presence and brain power and capacity of the AEA consulting team. We have an absolutely incredible team who is very passionate about the work that we do in regenerative agriculture and bring a lot of knowledge and experience and the capacity. I think this the phrase that was at the tip of my tongue was the capacity to produce miracles. And on the surface that may seem a bit pretentious, but it's not if it's true. And the reality is that having the privilege of working with growing systems and ecosystems is in some ways it's very similar parallel to working in human medicine, where we do have the capacity to produce miracles. And I think the same is true in our ecosystems as well. It's very rewarding, a lot of fun, and we have a really great team that works with some of the leading growers in this space. So the conversation for today, you have an opportunity to ask questions directly of our consulting team. I'm here as a moderator to guide the conversation, but I would ask you to ask the questions of the consultants here in our panel that have always bugged you or that have challenged you. What are the questions that you haven't been able to get answers to? Or perhaps saying it a different way is, what are the reservations that you have about possibly working with AEA? Here's your opportunity to ask those questions and get direct answers direct from the consulting team. So we're going to kick off the conversation. I have a few opening questions for the team, but then this is really intended to be your opportunity to ask questions of the team. So with that, I'm taking entirely too long for an introduction, but here I'll do a quick round of introductions just in the order that they appear on my screen. We have Tim Degroot, who is an AEA. Hi, Tim. Thanks for being here. Tim is an AEA staff consultant from California, working with all the diverse crops that you can imagine being present in the Central Valley. Then we have Kish Johnson from Virginia and Nathan Harman from Indiana. And Nathan, this is a great public setting, but I can't avoid it. Some years ago, I was just one of my mentors, Michael McNeil, gave me the dubious honor of being called a kook. He said a kook is a keeper of odd knowledge. And I recently passed on that nomination to Nathan as well. And because Nathan is one of these great people who he goes down lots of earthworm holes and he connects these intriguing dots that you would never expect to be connected, and is passionate about growing okra on a commercial scale. Then we have Kevin Tulley, who is a consultant from the Pacific Northwest, working with lots of tree fruit and potatoes and hops and lots of interesting crops in that region. Josh Young from Florida, working with strawberries and citrus and working in an environment where it would be great to have some soil instead of beach sand. And then Kip Harvey from blank. You call Texas home, right, Kip? Yeah. All right.
Texas is home.
Yeah. So we've got very broad geographic distribution from all over the country. And now is your opportunity to ask great questions. So we want to have this conversation be very practical and be very real. How do you implement and how do you execute on agronomic management systems that produce significant results? What's the practical application? What's the execution? How do you make it all happen? How do you make it all work? And so I'll kick things off with a question, and we'll just go around the circle because I'd love to get all of your perspective on this. Is what have you observed? We know that we have all experienced giving different growers a different set of recommendations that might be very similar conditions, similar context, and we make a similar set of recommendations. And with one grower, there is exceptional success, and perhaps with another grower, not the same degree of success. And there can be any broad array of reasons for why this might be the case. We know that agriculture includes lots of facets and lots of variability. And and sometimes that variability is also due to cultural management practices or just the capacity to execute. And so my question for each of you is, what have you observed when you're working with growers that really have a significant impact on the outcomes that growers experience with their crops? And it's a wide open question. It could be anything related to agronomy or management practices and so forth. So, Kish, I think I'm going to begin with you. How would you answer that question? What are the keys to success and practical execution that you've observed?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think twofold for me as we look across our grower base across the country. I think the first one is a little bit of a no-brainer in the sense of growers that are invested in being diligent and aware of what's going on in their on their operations, on their farms, and that have also a clear path to their long-term goals and how those challenges that come up, cyclically, annually, may impact those long-term goals, but that they have a plan in place to not just address the short-term goals and challenges as they come up year after year, but rather, are factoring in some of the long-term goals and challenges that have a continued vision to be able to stay on the course, stay on path to those things. From a very practical perspective, we obviously as a company talk a lot about our soil health program and the long-term ROI and impact that can have on any growing operation. And understanding that part in its context, along with all the actual crop applications that are being made throughout the year, and being able to have honest conversations here about what's working and how best to adjust to keep the grower on course, I think are some of the key elements for success coming out of the gate, at least.
Thank you, Kish. Taking the long view instead of the short view generally pays lots of dividends in the long term. Quite, yeah.
Slow and steady wins the race.
Yes, Josh, what are your thoughts?
Well, I see that not asking questions, being afraid to get help when needed is a very good old boy thing to do. And trusting the wrong source of information. We don't know what we don't know. We've been taught by the best, and yet we have the results are saying otherwise, that this is the best program to call. So ask the right questions, you'll get it. Ask and you shall receive. I think the Bible says.
Thanks, Josh. Nathan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the biggest, in addition to what these guys both said, the 6 principles of soil health, right? Of keeping covered and keeping a root in the field, and integrating animal disturbance to the degree you can, and soil armor, all that. Any one of those employed for any amount of time is a step forward, right? I think that kind of background can't be lost. Those things are all very true, and layering on every higher order management practice or using multiple of those techniques at the same time, and they do have a lot of overlaps. I think that's one thing that really, is a difference between things working and moving in the right direction without just being another input replacement, kind of system. And the other is creativity, just to try something new, just to experiment and be willing to always be running a trial or 2 or 10, and really following up with those things and making yourself accountable. Often growers who don't just do the trial on their own, but publicize it and say they're going to be let people know that they can expect some data back on this, or working with SARE, or the network of sharing that information and committing to being part of it. Those growers always have some form of success to report back on.
Yeah, I think building on what you just said, Nathan, it's in many cases it's not where you have your biggest successes that you learn the most from. It's where you make mistakes and things don't go as you expected that are significant learning opportunities. Tim, I'll go to you next. How would you answer the question of what are foundational pieces that really result in growers excelling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you think about foundational stuff and critical, factors for grower success, right? As Kish and Josh and Nathan all described, right, their ideas and ways of doing things and thinking about stuff that have adverse effects that trickle down the line of success, right? So I guess I would say, getting a little bit more in the specificity, right, of talking about like our programs and stuff like that. One of the biggest things and the main thing that we believe in is, soil health and, that type of thing, right? So introduction of biology, our soil primers, stuff like that, that just, that's truly a foundation of how we approach our programs, right? We've seen it, work miracles in soil with nutrient availability, uptake, water holding capacity, right? There's all those factors that go in, right? They talk about the big picture, the mentality, the thinking stuff. You get to the actual physical stuff in the field like that, and then that trickles into more and more things that are going to be continued success for a grower, right? In a program, right, you're continually, taking Sap analysis and, assessing a crop and where it's at on its health spectrum. But, if you can better utilize what's in the ground, to get that regenerative cycle started, that's kind of square one in our type of program. So, yeah.
Nice.
Thank you, Tim. Josh, I see you nodding your head. We've got a few more guys. Is there something you wanted to add to that?
I just was agreeing with him.
Yeah. And I think the point that several of you have made now is not losing sight of the basics. Like there's conversations that I participate in regularly where people get really excited about using microbes and using microbial inoculants and so forth. And to the point that Nathan made, we can't lose sight of using cover crops and taking care of those basics so that we provide the environment for all the rest of the system to work. So anyway, you're not here to hear from me today. Kevin, I'm going to go over to you. How would you respond to the question?
Yeah, I have a couple things. One, another basic that's very practical, nitty-gritty thing is water quality. It can be a big factor in how well we can succeed, as AEA on a farm is if, water is your number one input. And if you have a water quality issue that has not been addressed, it can make our program much less effective. So that's something we always try to look at when we start with a farm is look at your water quality and make sure that we've got that covered before we try to adjust the finer details. And a broader thing is a factor for success for growers is how much people understand the science in order to really believe in the principles of regenerative agriculture enough to be able to see through the challenging things and the many variables and factors, like you mentioned. There's so many factors and variables that can cause roadblocks and bumps in the road in our path to success. And if you have a good foundational understanding of the science, then you can have the tools to be able to look through those barriers and make it through them into the next level of success. But if you're really on the fence and kind of think, maybe not, this is and not really sure about this whole concept of regenerative agriculture or how micronutrients and biology and seed products all work together, then I've seen people get turned away because they encounter a roadblock like water quality, and that comes down on this whole system is baloney. I'm going back to something else. So those are my two things: water quality and really having a deep understanding of the science that creates enough belief and understanding of the system to keep you moving forward.
That's a really great point, Kevin, and an interesting observation. And do you find, have you observed that this knowledge base, this scientific understanding, is this something that growers need to have for themselves, or can they hire this in their agronomists and crop scouts?
I think it really has to come from the grower themselves, in my experience. It's really helpful to have everybody on board. What works best is when the grower has a good understanding, and same with their agronomist and their irrigation guy, and their person that does their pest control. If everybody's on board, that's the best. But the most important thing is the grower.
Yeah,
to me,
I completely agree with your assessment. It's I've found it really interesting that for many of the growers who've been exceptionally successful, is they don't want to delegate that knowledge to anyone else. They want to know that for themselves. Yeah. Kip, you're the only person we haven't heard from so far, and we've had lots of great responses. So I'm really curious to see what you'll come up with to add to what we've discussed already.
There's really nothing much to add to that. Being out here in West Texas, where regenerative farming is not the common practice, those that are being successful are the ones that's going out there and gaining that knowledge, trying to find out how the system actually works. So the successes are coming, even those that do minimal research, that find out and go out and try it. That's who's seeing the most success right now. It's over the conventional way of doing things.
And I think one of the pieces that often comes up in transitioning from a mainstream view to a regenerative agriculture management type of system is there's often conversations around a change of mindset. And a change of mindset is often a result of learning new information or learning new knowledge or things that we didn't realize we didn't know. And so that's why we have conversations like this one.
Yeah, we don't know what we don't know. Until we know it, we don't even know we didn't know it. But then once we know the truth sets us free, and then we can't go back anymore this way. That's why this is a movement, because it's open source knowledge. If you need to know, it's there. Just have to ask the right question.
Yeah. So there's a few questions that have come through on the Q&A, and I just ask our entire audience, if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of our screen, bottom of your screen, I guess I should say. And then we can direct those. We're just going to have an open conversation. And if there's not a lot of questions coming through, then I have plenty for the team. But you'll get the most out of this webinar, out of this discussion, if you ask your questions and are able to get them answered. So there's a question here from Ari, who I'm in California, where we have water that's very high in bicarbonate salts. I've heard of using humic acid to help the negative effects. Could you please elaborate on the effectiveness as well as the suggested use rate for this application? So Tim, being that you are in California and deal with this all the time, actually, I guess Kevin does as well. A number of you do, all of you do. But I'll refer that question to you. How would you respond?
You want to start, Kevin, here? I'm trying to find the question here so I can read through it here.
Yeah, sure. For bicarbonates, if you have high bicarbonates, you're not going to be able to treat all your water unless you go to maybe a sulfur burner type system. But the most important thing that we would say is at least treat your foliar water. If you're doing foliars with micronutrients, you definitely don't want to be using that high bicarbonate water. So either find another nearby source where you can get that foliar water, or at least just treat that foliar water as with either a RO, reverse osmosis machine, or some people will use sulfuric acid. I don't know if that's the best thing for a foliar situation, but on a bigger scale, if you're going to treat all your water, I think the main go-to is sulfur burner.
Yeah, Ari, I know we've talked in the past, not on this specifically, but Yeah, I was going to say make the same point as Kevin, right? We've had a lot of people that have had water issues like that, and they treat the irrigation stuff, but they don't take into account the stuff that's going into the spray as well. So as far as humic acid, yes, it's definitely, oh, it just disappeared. But yeah, that's like Kevin was saying, sulfur burners, humic acid, those are ways that we can use to mitigate those deals. But yeah, the biggest thing is, in those sprays to also take that into account.
Yeah. And Tim, I was the one moderating the questions and making it disappear once you started answering it. So apologies for that. And the piece that I would just add is that humic substances can be appropriate use when you have small quantities of bicarbonates, if you have less than 100 parts per million or something like that. But when you get to the high quantities that are common in irrigation water on the West Coast, then it's not economically viable or effective enough usually to put on the quantities required to produce the effects that are really needed. Here's a good question. As an AEA consultant, what is the to-do list you are prescribed when you visit any new farm? What are the top common suggestions to all farmers? This is a really good question, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, perhaps Vijay or Vijay. So thank you. That's a great question. Let me see. Who do we want to go to? Nathan, I think I'm going to direct this question to you and to Kish, the two of you, if you could respond.
Sure. Yeah, well, obviously there's a lot of context involved, where are they? What are you growing? It's that first interview process of trying to understand, some history and some goals and et cetera. On the data side, wherever Sap Analysis is appropriate, we want to figure out how we're going to do that during the season. We want to look at any existing soil data for what use it is. We got to make sure we're, hitting any of your standards on organics or food safety, et cetera. Make sure we know the direction we're, allowed to go and what equipment you have and et cetera. Once we get that worked out, very directly to your question, I think the one thing that I can offhand recommend anywhere is some variation of our soil primer. Whether we steer that towards a fall soil primer or a spring soil primer, or before each crop in a multi-harvest vegetable operation, or somewhere in the orchard floor, at some point or multiple points, we're gonna want to slip in Rejuvenate and Sea Shield and Spectrum or another inoculant that's more suited to your need. That's basically for sure, right? And that's all guaranteed to start or further wherever you are trying to get. Beyond that, we're gonna start looking at specific minerals, right? We're gonna see where we know from any data existing, whether that be on a soil report or what we're seeing physically in the plants, some photos, some knowledge about the insects or diseases you're having, and start right away tailoring in on a few minerals we know are going to fit the need. That's a bare bones approach. Know that you're kicking your biology up, and know that you're providing the stuff that might not be in the system, and go from there.
Thank you, Nathan. Kish?
Yeah, as Nathan said, context is everything, of course, on any interaction. Perhaps to put it another way, we know that all photosynthesis is not created equal, and not all goals and challenges are created equal, and they actually do vary a lot. So, coming out of the gate, we've got to have very practical, real conversations with, coming back to what we said earlier, what those long-term goals and challenges are, as well as the short-term, to make sure that we are in alignment with where we're going. That can seem perhaps a little bit oversimplistic, but it's a key part of making sure that we understand where you as the grower, where you as the operations manager of your farm are wanting to go, and what is going to be attainable. I think we are looking to build a lot of trust equity from a relational piece in our relationships with growers, and I would perhaps put this a little bit more boldly to say that we're also looking to leave behind the old models where so much trust was implicitly put on the grower to trust the fertilizer guy, the salesperson, whatever, with a lack of awareness of what we're doing, why we're doing it. And, we have a pretty robust database that gives us a very good insight before seeing the actual data of what's going on farm. In other words, our programs are based on our experience, and we can fairly accurately calibrate the starting place per the context and operation of pretty much most crops. But we also don't, we've said this 1,000 times, I think probably John, you've said this a lot, right? That we're not guessing at AEA. And so part of that accountability and that trust equity also comes with letting these data sets of Sap Analysis particularly hold us both accountable and hold us to that long-term and short-term goal. And so being able to come in alignment with the grower, using that data piece to continue the conversation and the direction for what we're applying when, creating a road of, what to do and how to get there are the key pieces from a perhaps a slightly different perspective.
Thank you, Kish and Nathan. Those were great answers. And for the rest of you on the team who are here on this call, is there anything that you would like to add to that? Because it's a great question. So what is on your common to-do list when you speak to a new farm, and what are your common suggestions?
One thing I'd like to know is how often are they willing to test? How much knowledge do they want to gain by SAP testing? And I don't think you can test it too much. So that's one thing I like to ask.
Yeah, that's a great addition, Kip. Thank you for that.
Yeah, finding the problems. Actually Kish brings this up a lot. Is what are the goals, and what are the problems, and then how can we help you solve those problems? Quit treating symptoms. So the more we can understand holistically, you might be doing fine in the crop, but losing money on labor or losing money on cultural practices, on irrigation. So we go to those critical points of influence of the farm whole ecosystem, and we try to stop the dam up here, while working on photosynthesis, while hitting our marks within the crop frame, but then looking holistically of who's buying this crop. How can we sell nutrient dense fruit? How are we going to get there on the end? And we have to build it from a firm foundation. So the more data we can get, and if not, we'll go out there and we'll take a paste analysis. We'll take a water test, take some B horizon tests to understand, what's going on and where the lost minerals are. So that's, definitely, it's holistic.
Thanks, Josh. We have another question here from Greg Stack, who's a wine grape grower in California and is working with no-till practices and using roller crimpers to manage cover crops and in between the rows. They've been having a lot of drought stress for the last couple of years. And Greg's question is, what do you believe has happened to the soil biological life in these times when we don't receive rainfall for months at a time? So Kip and Tim, if you'd like to respond to those, you both work with soils that experience these types of challenges, or if anyone else wants to chime in as well. But Kip, do you have any thoughts on that?
What do I think happens to the biology in the soil? Well, in the no-till situation where you're protecting the top of the soil, I just think, it goes, for lack of a better word, it goes dormant and is waiting for that rain. It's pretty resilient out here in these drought-stricken areas, and it knows to wait on that rain. So I wish in our wine grapes out here in Texas, I wish we did more of the no-till, the roller crimping, because of bare ground, there's no telling what is happening to our biology out here.
It's toasting. That's what.
So I would call it sterilizing the ground. What happens to it? I just think it just stays there waiting for the chance to get the moisture it needs.
Yep. Tim?
Yeah, I'd like to add, with the biological life, right? It needs that moisture. It needs that food source to survive, right? So When you have dry soil, right, things can be laying dormant, like Kip said, or it could be dying off a bit, right? So waiting for that rainfall. So, the cover, crop and mowing it, that'll definitely help keep those soil temperatures down, help you retain a little bit more moisture and keep that biological life going. But yeah, definitely during the drought, right, it does take a toll on your microbial populations. But, I guess, a recommendation, right, is just, being able to keep that water on as much as possible, right? Or getting that deep watering in and hopefully getting that biological presence deeper in that root system, right? Where things are not going to be drying out. I think a lot of times when people are putting stuff on, they don't get it quite deep enough in that soil profile. And so then, yeah, you're losing a lot of that life. But the deeper you can get that life, down into the ground, into that deep root system where things will not be drying out, the better retention you're going to have on those microbials.
Thank you, Tim. We've got a number of questions coming through, so I'm going to move right along. There's a question here from our good friend Michael Adsit. Hi, Michael. From an organic apple orchard in Michigan, using AEA products and other stuff in our foliar program. Michael says, I can normally reach 18 to 22 Brix in the leaf sap, so no insect feeding. Congratulations. It's a lot of fun to be at that stage. That said, the baby apples on our trees only have a Brix of about 8 to 10, so we go a lot of plum curculio and codling moth damage. Later at maturity, the fruit Brix will be 16 to 18. We do use codling moth mating disruptors. Any thoughts on how to boost the Brix in early apples to make them more insect resistant? Seems like the tree after petal drop is in growth mode and seems to not move sugars into the fruit at that stage. Are there any thoughts? Plum curculio is a real bane. Tried a lot of things without much success. It's a great question, Michael. Nathan and Kevin, I know both of you have lots of tree fruit experience, so I'll direct the question to you, but if anyone else wants to chime in, please do so.
Yeah, sure. I work in Michigan a fair bit. And so I think first, let's think about the difference between sugar and Brix, right? Brix is all total dissolved solids. So it's including sugars and all the other mineral components that might be in the fruit tissue or the leaf sap test, etc. So early on, fruits aren't supposed to have a lot of sugar. They're not supposed to get sweet until they ripen. So we're not trying to move more sugar into the fruit. So our only option to increase the Brix there is the rest of the total dissolved solids, the other minerals. So obviously, let's look at a sap test and see if there are any no-brainers. From a leaf perspective, we don't use as much tissue testing commonly or fruit quality testing during the season. It's just kind of prohibitively expensive to get a lot of that data, unfortunately. So there's going to be differences between what goes in the apple and what goes in the leaf. But let's look at those. Certainly calcium is a great thing that we want to increase in that fruit, and as part of that total dissolved solids. But all the micronutrients can play lots of roles in pumping up that apple, and that all has to be done, very, very early, right? At pollination and for the first few weeks thereafter, to really prime those blossoms and early fruits with more availability of other minerals. That would be my thinking there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, Nathan, other than just looking at sap and trying to really understand what's going on, and then being really aggressive with those early pre-sap foliars, and particularly calcium.
I would throw in also that potassium, right? Potassium is very much a back and forth thing with apple management. It's really important on a varietal basis. And, not having enough potassium, growers who have really drunk the Kool-Aid are super cautious about potassium. And I would say it's super important, right? It is absolutely a basic macronutrient growth element and is a critical component of sap. So potassium might be one of the big things to look at.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nathan. And the one thing I would add to this discussion is When you think about the young green fruit, the capacity to move dissolved solids into that developing fruit is a function of the auxin synthesis of the seeds. The more auxins you synthesize, the more dissolved solids are going to move into the fruit. And auxin synthesis is correlated with trace mineral nutrition, particularly manganese. So when you have really high concentrations of manganese, but also zinc and boron in that developing fruit, you're going to have lots of sugar movement and other nutrient movement into the fruit. So there might be a case to be made for exceptionally high levels or generous levels of trace minerals at that particular stage, which, to Nathan's point, is going to happen pollination or even pre-pollination. Anyone else want to add anything to that? No? All right. So there's next question here from John Warmerdam. Hi, John. We believe we are at level 2 on the plant health pyramid for most of our stone fruit blocks. And what are some of the things that we should look for to guide us to level 3 and beyond? I'll open this up to anyone. Tim, would you like to respond to this? Or anyone else?
I think for getting into level 1, 3, and 4, where you get into lipid synthesis and feeding off plant secondary metabolites, if you're hitting level 2, it will, I'd say it's I think it can be a quick process up to 3 and 4, but I would be looking at the feel and look at the leaf. There should be a waxy cuticle on there so that when insects land, try to chew, it's not as easy for them to get in. A high Brix leaf is a leaf that a butterfly or a moth doesn't want to lay her babies there because it's not a good environment for the next generation. So she might take a bite, but then she'll keep moving along. So you should be able to see that. You should be able to see, in my mind, you should start seeing the predators back. Today, as I was scouting, we're seeing more spiders, more lacewings, more ladybugs. And so if you're seeing those higher level of predators, I feel like you can rest assured that you're getting up that plant health pyramid. So I don't know if anyone else had anything to add to that.
I want to perhaps clarify John's question as I'm understanding it is, what are the practical steps? What are the next pieces that need to be in place in order to get to level 3?
Yeah, I'll say this. A very practical look at the nitrogen management piece to make sure that the management practices of nitrogen are not contributing to level 3 or level 4 being out of reach. So that would be a good starting point. And then everything else, very simply, or from an overview perspective, would be driving biology, not guessing about biology being there, being very diligent in making sure that there's what we would call the food and housing for that biological population. And then also just the balanced nutrition, right? Those two key pieces of a robust microbial population and balanced nutrition within the crop itself, are really setting you, in a good trajectory towards reaching those level 3s and 4s in the plant health pyramid.
Thank you, Kish. Anyone else want to chime in? No?
Yeah, level 1 and 2 are chemistry, and beyond that, it's all about biology.
Thank you, guys. Next question is here from Erwin. We have a biodynamic farm, and this season in a cold, wet climate in spring, ammonium levels in the plant sap spiked, even with appropriate magnesium, calcium, and potassium levels in the plant sap. This is without the use of manure, only using cover crops. Have you observed similar situations, and how would you address this situation? Let me see. Kevin, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, typically when I think of ammonium levels spiking, I think of when it gets really hot and the plant goes into proteolysis. So this one I'm not as sure about, and I'd be more guessing about. But when I think of ammonium, I think of just the general nitrogen processing, micronutrients being moly, boron, magnesium, sulfur. So, you're speaking to magnesium, calcium, and potassium, but I'd look at those other nutrients as well.
Thanks, Kevin. Anyone else want to chime in on this? There's, go ahead, Nathan.
I would say that I do see a little bit of trailing of ammonium numbers with time of day of the samples being taken. Later in the day, you're going to see a little increase. I don't know how much you're talking about. So that's one potential factor to look at. And ammonium levels is one of the things that I personally don't harp on until I have a string of data consistently showing really high ammonium levels, because they change very quickly with weather and moisture and temperature, and it's one of the more volatile numbers on the SAP test. So I really like to see trend data before I get too spooked out about it. Did you mention the crop?
There was not any mention of a crop, no.
Okay. So also, we have to face facts that there are potential ideals for ammonium levels, but the reason we ask for varietal information and more crop information than maybe is sometimes on a test request is because plants have different levels of ammonium that they may be happy with, and we're just learning that. So the plant type really does play into it.
Thanks, Nathan. One piece that I'll add to this is that you mentioned having cold and wet climate. And when you think about what that means for soil, if you have saturated soil or wet soil conditions, then that will lead to a reduced environment, which will lead to nitrogen converting to the form of ammonium, which is probably where your ammonium is coming from. And I think Kevin's answer addressed this, that the nutrients to address are magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and boron. And occasionally, if there is cloudy and overcast weather with limited sunlight, you may also need to address carbohydrates because the plant may not be photosynthesizing enough to convert ammonium. But if you do address those elements, then you should see your ammonium levels dropping. There's a really interesting question here from Gary Nicely. Hi, Gary. The question is, what types of tillage tools and practices are you observing on the most successful broadacre growers, particularly growers whose goal is not no-till specifically? So I'll open this up to any one of you who wants to respond, because I know that you've seen all types of different interactions. So what are you seeing that is most successful?
We're just young on a project, but a yeoman's plow with most soils, even sandy soils, we're finding a compaction layer between 14 and 24 inches. And from what, I don't know, tractor use or, but getting below that plow level. And as we're thinking about resetting the system and starting over, if you will, in these situations, going no-till at this point would be great, but getting that some oxygen, even in the commercial strawberry growers, we've deep shanked for years, sometimes a pesticide down there to control nematodes. But to me, this is just the pasture version or of deep shanking and breaking that soil up one time to get the pieces to where it can be built back quickly and effectively. I know different systems and different soils. I'm in Florida. That's a little different than broadacre, but maybe some of you broadacre guys will jump in there and save me.
Well, there's a lot, there's a strip till, is certainly a nice compromise. It allows you to do the most important parts of seed placement and fertilizer management and early spring, while still working with the diversity of potential, covers or roll downs or other, and then, get a little strip of black soil to increase some heat right there. So early on strip till, there's great stuff going on in all the variations of, finger weeders and more delicate tine weeders. And, I think that the small, minimal kind of scratching the surface cultivation more than tillage equipment is really moving ahead and can be used for some early passes. As far as complete tillage, I still like to avoid it unless you have a very good reason, unless you have the right kind of amount of biomass on top that you can easily kill with a minimal turn, like 3-4 inches maximum. You know, if you can get under a root layer and put a lot of biomass into and on the soil, and have a kind of combined tillage event with a large amount of biomass, then that can still move you forward. But barring a substantial amount of biomass, I'd really like to see as little soil turning as possible. There's some ideas.
Yeah, maybe to echo something Don Huber said very recently last week at the Acres Conference is, within the no-till context, and we are, of course, all creatures of extremes oftentimes. And we go from, no-till, I'm not going to create any soil disturbance as the goal. And then on the other end, we have lots of disturbance. And in the no-till, piece, I think it's important to put a reminder in there about the potential of denitrification in no-till operations, and that the goal ultimately is to have good gas exchange in the soil profile. And so, if that means going back to starting with a subsoiler, and dealing with, compaction layers, as Josh was indicating earlier, then, that's what needs to happen. But then also just kind of, more to what Nathan was saying, measuring and understanding what the pros and cons are of an action on your farm. If I do X, what's the upside and what's the downside to that, and adjusting accordingly.
Thank you, Kish. Anyone else want to chime in on this question?
Yeah, so far I haven't seen anything that any one tillage thing that's head and shoulders above the other one, but I would like to say that, there's everybody's system is different, from the VT passes, making it work, to the strip till, all the way to no-till. People are having successes either way. It's how they fit their systems and how they use it. We use minimum till a lot out here for wind erosion, but we might have to use that because during harvest might be wet. We might have that compaction layer, so we might have to go in there and prep that seed bed and get some compaction out. So as far as what single tillage tool that's head and shoulders above the rest, haven't seen it, but I'm sure there might be something out there. But just there's no solid answer for that one.
Yeah. There's Kip makes a very important point, and it's come up a couple of times. There's this intense debate about till versus no till, and quite frankly, I think the conversation is less than useful, because it creates division, it creates polarity, and we at the beginning of this conversation, Kish and several of the consultants just talked about context and understanding context and making context relevant to decisions. And early on, I was asked my opinion about this polarity and this difference of opinion quite frequently. And so I started paying attention to what are the farms that are really successful in different contexts and different environments. And to my surprise, I discovered that there are extraordinarily successful no-till operations and extraordinarily successful operations that do a lot of tillage. And when I say successful, I should qualify that. I mean specifically successful in the context of building amazing soil profiles, sequestering lots of carbon, building lots of organic matter, having very large earthworm populations. I saw successes in both farms that were doing a lot of tillage, maybe I shouldn't say a lot of tillage, but they were certainly doing annual tillage, let's say it that way, and farms that were completely no-till. However, there was one common theme. All the farms that were developing biology to that degree were doing intensive cover cropping. So I think the conversation should not be just about tillage. It should be about the whole management system and how the pieces all fit together. And the one piece I would add to this discussion is that we need tillage implements which only have lifting action without compression action, which is something that the yeoman's plow does. And the only other tillage tool that I'm aware of that has that effect, and there's many that I don't know about, so certainly don't have universal knowledge, but there is another one, very effective vertical tillage tool called the Curse Buster. And it's not widely known, and it deserves to be much more widely known. So something worth looking at and digging into deeper. It is a very effective vertical tillage tool that lifts soil up without disturbing the surface significantly, which I think is an important characteristic that we should all observe more frequently, be more familiar with.
I think might just get one for the name, a curse buster. That might really help us on the farm.
Yeah. All right. There is a question here from Cassandra. Cassandra, look, this upcoming season will be my first year with your program, and I'm very excited about that. My question is on the plant health pyramid. How do we measure advances in the plant health pyramid? How do we know where we are? Who wants to chime in on this one?
I think as unison, we all said plant sap analysis probably as number one to know, because the first step in the plant health pyramid is photosynthesis. And so we need to know, and we can use our eyes visualization, depending on what you're growing, a strawberry or citrus, you should be able to look at the leaf, and whether the yellowing is coming from the new growth or the old growth, you can deduce whether it is a mobile element or an immobile element. But sap analysis is the best. We need nitrogen, magnesium, iron, manganese, and phosphorus. And if we can get that moving, we can get the system started.
Thanks, Josh. Great points. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I have the privilege of working with Cassandra and excited about this. And, I think one of the first things you're going to see, level one, dealing with fungal diseases. And I already know you're excited about the potential of maybe not having to use fungicides. And that's a big opener. And that's level one. We really want to see some reductions in soil-borne root rot, fungal pathogens. So, once, that's kind of as devastating as that can be, that's one of the earlier results. So then you march right up and you can gauge in, yes, sap analysis, and yes, the visual of the plants, but also what's not happening to it, what diseases and insects are not occurring.
Thanks, Nathan. We've had quite a few questions coming through, so I'm not sure exactly where to begin. I'll begin with a question from Adrian. I cultivate organic onions in a drained peat soil containing over 10% humus. As of now, all of my leaf sap analysis have shown too much ammonium. I do not add any nitrogen to the culture, so I suppose the problem is due to mechanical weed control, which mineralizes too much ammonium. When the weather is humid, Phytophthora thrives. Yes, it would, as a result of the high ammonium. And let me see, who should I direct this to? Well, I'll just open it. Do any of you have any comments on managing ammonium? We actually talked about it a little bit earlier. So I'll just maybe address it quickly and then we'll move on. So the key to ammonium is magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum, and sugars. You address that combination and you should see ammonium levels drop. And I'm specifically referring to in the plant. And then, of course, from a longer term perspective, we might think about changing our soil management so that we don't have that flush of available ammonium at that particular moment. There's a question here from Stuart Farr. What is the most practical way to determine the amount and type of microorganisms in the soil? Kish, I'll direct that one to you. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, yeah, to the first point, I would say there's a visual in terms of, the biological piece being part of, seeing that health increase in the crop. The second would be also, there's some pretty interesting companies out there that are doing some very interesting testing and categorization of biology in the rhizosphere, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely some people out there that could start dialing that in terms of what's going on in your context. If that helps.
Yeah, and I just add the micro aggregation and macro aggregation. So looking at your roots and seeing if it's a small plant, a pepper, and you can hold it up and all the soil's holding on to those roots, that biology is working. So really being in tune to what's going on below the soil can help you deduce what's going on above.
Great point, Josh. I think that soil aggregate structure and aggregate stability is one of the best parameters that really describes overall microbial integrity. There's a follow-up question here from Erwin. Arden Anderson mentions the use of vitamins such as B12, vitamin C, and folate in agriculture. Is this something that you look at or is ever consulted by AEA? And I have some thoughts on this, but I want to open it up. Any thoughts or ideas on this? Nathan or anyone else?
I haven't specifically gotten to measuring or applying.
Well, we have actually, but we just don't talk about it in that context. I'll just say briefly that vitamin B12 or vitamin C, ascorbic acid or ascorbates, or any of these vitamins are all a result of microbial activity and good nutrition. So for example, you don't produce, soil biology produces abundant B12, more than crops require, as long as they have access to cobalt. So when you address cobalt nutrition, that is going to address vitamin B12. And so the answer is that, yes, we do include it in our consulting work at AEA, but not directly. We don't talk about vitamin B12. Instead, with our SAP analysis, we evaluate cobalt and make recommendations for cobalt, and that addresses vitamin B12. Yeah. There's a question here from Anne Marie, wine grape grower in Ontario. Our area has almost 50% more rain during ripening in September and October than ever before. Brix accumulation completely stalled during this time, with heavy botrytis and sour rot on the fruit began. Should we continue foliar minerals into the harvest or up to harvest to have help boost Brix readings and deter fruit rot? Who would like to respond to that? So you have wine grape harvest with high rains or approaching harvest and high rainfall conditions. And the question is, should we continue with foliar sprays up until the harvest period to increase Brix readings?
I would say yes. If any opportunity to foster nutrition and take the stress of that fruit fail off, using SAP analysis can be helpful. Tanneobiologics, we use Micro 5000 as a biological inoculant foliarly. We want to keep our good bacteria up as much as possible to ward off bad bacteria, bad funguses. So in my opinion, absolutely. Seaweed would be great. Just keep that stress down.
Thank you, Josh. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, it's, you never know what the weather is about to do. But grapes are legitimately sensitive to high moisture situations and bad weather during ripening. It's a risk that will come along more years than not, right? And as much as possible, people have gone to climates that give them the correct weather conditions for growing grapes. And that's the definition of a grape climate. But we've gone all over the place, and we're going to have to deal with these bad fall conditions in grape crops. And one of our absolutely primary tools is to make sure that we're providing the microbial habitat to outcompete the negatives, and that we have full mineral nutrition there. So it's still, there are places at which the weather is just too much. Too much and too little water are still massive issues, but you got to do what you can.
I'd like to follow real quick. Botrytis is formed usually in a bloom stage, and 14 to 16 hours of leaf wetness is usually the trigger. The biology is more than it can handle, so all of a sudden there's a weak spot there. So that's when I would be really watching. When you get to 16, 18 hours of complete leaf wetness, could be an area of vulnerability for you.
Yep.
Setting that bloom up right before that point will really help you not have botrytis in the first place.
There's a follow-up comment here from Craig, which is just that I wouldn't foliar spray in a high humidity situation. And I think, in fact, our usual recommendation would be the opposite, that we would foliar spray in high humidity situations. As long as you don't have so much rainfall that the foliar spray gets washed off the leaf, obviously that's a problem. But you get the highest performance from foliar sprays when they remain liquid on the leaf surface for the longest period of time. So when you have high humidity conditions, that's actually when you can be very effective with foliar applications. There's a question here that is really a great question for you as a team. What does it take to become an AEA consultant? And I think this is a good question. I'd love to get your take on it. Kish, I'm going to go to you first, and then perhaps Kevin, and then anyone else who wants to chime in.
Yeah, for us at AEA, very, very simply, it is a fundamental passion about the work that we're doing. Most of us are avid devourers of all information that we can get, especially the cutting edge kind, and the willingness to sort of unlearn and learn as well. There's a lot of stuff that has historically been out there that we just don't find to be true. So there's obviously an aptitude for learning is important, but there's going to be some unlearning, if I can put it as coarsely as that, in the journey. And then, a love for the industry and the grower, and a passion to make, for us, make people more profitable in the industry and see successes. We have the most fun when growers are having fun doing what they love to do. So.
Thank you, Kish. Kevin, I'm going to go to you next. What does it take to become an AEA consultant? You're on mute, Kevin.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
You're not trying to talk.
I would just echo what Kish said, and that it just takes a constant willingness to keep learning and staying humble. We work with so many really amazing growers who know so much more about their particular crop and their situation than we do. And we come in with our expertise and have the opportunity to learn and grow together with growers. So I think it's, having the willingness to continue learning and being educated from AEA and everything we learn at AEA and our resources here, and then being humble and going on the journey with the grower.
I'd love to hear from the rest of you as well. Any thoughts that you would like to add?
And to the end of what Kevin was saying too, right? It's becoming a consultant, right? Like it is that drive that to do something different, right? To do something in a better way than it has been done. But also, right, as a consultant, we don't know everything, right? We're constantly learning, and we're constantly, evolving in what the process is and the practices that we utilize with our growers. We're learning from them, they're learning from us, right? We go into it as not I'm going to tell you everything how to do it, and that's the way you got to do it, right? It's I'm going to share my knowledge in your situations, and we can have that discussion of, where do we go from here? How does it best suit what we're trying to accomplish, right? We're, as consultants, right, we're not just out there to tell you how it's done and leave, right? We're there to, actually work with you and, to find that common ground and address those challenges that you have.
Thank you, Tim.
Well, I'll say from our newest consultant, and a shout out to Corey St. Clair, it was patience and a lot of trusting the spirit that he was heading in the right path. And he kept calling me, and I kept encouraging him to study, and going through 5 interviews and going through the deep process that AEA uses to hire. I would say that you should apply now so that you could continue as we get spots available. We're trying to put the best people in place. So go ahead and be bold. If you think this is your calling, then you should apply.
It would be interesting for all of the one thing that I would propose you all think about is, what is the things that were not mentioned by the team as being qualifiers to be consultants for AEA? There was no mention of a certain degree. There was no mention of a certain knowledge base or knowledge requirement. In fact, we have we have an amazing team of amazing consultants, and you've met many of them on this webinar. One that comes to mind is David Miller. David's been with AEA for 11 years. He was a school teacher before he came to work for us. Rochelle Robertson was a chemistry teacher. And so it's not necessarily the qualifications as much as it is the right passion and heart and commitment. So thank you for sharing that to all of you on the team. There's a question here from Stephen. Is there a resource you can recommend that will tell me how long fertigated nutrients, such as potassium sulfate, take to become available to the crop? Nathan, I see you nodding your head.
Well, yeah, I wish there was an easy answer besides the same one that we always give, which is Sap Analysis.
Exactly.
But no, that's completely what you care about is the crop, what's getting into the crop, then take a Sap Analysis, unfortunately, to actually determine the period of availability and the span of availability. You could set up some pretty sophisticated trials, but if you apply and then sample 2 weeks later, right? Sample before and then apply and sample 2 weeks later. Well, we don't know if it happened on day 2 or day 12 or what. So if you really want to find those answers, setting up very frequent Sap Analysis to determine that, that changeover in induction. Beyond that, for most crops, that kind of couple weeks period is enough to satisfy the growth curves and hit the critical points of influence. So we're not recommending daily sap sampling, but you got to test for what you want to find out.
Thank you, Nathan. Anyone else want to respond to that? I'll add one thought, which is that Nathan mentioned the frequency of analysis to be able to find this out. If you have a high value crop, you can't afford not to do more frequent analysis to find out exactly what the nutrient release curve is, because it is going to be specific to you. There are a few well-hidden and difficult to find nutrient release curves that have been published by different research institutions on what the potassium sulfate release curve looks like. But it's going to be very different on your soil versus soil that has different geological and microbial populations. So if you have very different biology, it's really dependent on biology and moisture. And so it can vary by as much as 2 to 3x. And so if you really want to have good information, you need to know what it's like for your conditions. And that's why Sap Analysis is the king that we just keep talking about over and over again.
Well, but I do have to backpedal a little bit. The two handheld meters that are reasonably effective and representative are for potassium and nitrate. The kind of classic multiple brands have, handheld field test meters, or some that you have to take back in and do some regents and a little stirring in a home lab. But potassium being one of the most mobile, and even in an organic form, salty of minerals, should have pretty quick uptake and shows up in a traditional handheld meter.
Yep.
So potassium and nitrate, beyond that, I wouldn't really go with any of those. This same question with almost any other mineral, just sap testing.
Yeah.
I would like to give a real quick response on that, a kind of an example of something that we went through this year with potassium, specifically through fertigation. We did, the Sap Analysis, but we actually compared in some blocks fertigating potassium versus foliar potassium, and actually figuring out what are the jumps in the Sap Analysis there. What's the longevity? How often were we having to apply in foliar versus the ground, and et cetera, right? So that was just kind of my grower example of, the power of Sap Analysis in determining those things, right? That is the number one tool for most of these questions, right? And what we're trying to determine.
And I'll bring up one more personal direct experience this year with a vegetable crop in Wisconsin, where the grower did this really cool rig of modifying an air seeder to actually deliver dry gypsum and potassium sulfate. So we were micromanaging weekly and biweekly applications of gypsum and potassium sulfate as a cheaper and better option for their equipment and their setup. And wish I'd seen more cool stuff, but they had really bad drought through much of the season. And basically we saw that potassium uptake really spike after rain, when you got solubility. we weren't really low or battling. We're actually trying to keep our potassium low for a variety of reasons. But every time it rained, those applications that we were trying to micromanage just flooded the system.
Thanks, Nathan and Tim. Those are important observations and experiences to share. And again, I just in general, the foundation of success in agronomy is based on the mantra of don't guess when you can test. Because particularly with the cost of fertilizers today, it's a lot less expensive and more accurate to test than it is to guess. There's a question here from Ed Kelly. Do you recommend a particular testing laboratory for soil analysis, or is the usual county or USDA testing adequate? And particularly, I'm aware that in this area, we have very high pH or alkaline soil. What is the best way to bring this down? And what guidance would you recommend or can you point to for the new farmer in evaluating soil data in general? So a couple of questions there. And I'll open it to anyone. Josh, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, sir. The lab depends on the test we want to run. For most of our basic tests, we use Logan Labs out of Ohio. We usually run a soil test plus and paste analysis. If we want to go another level, we usually go to Midwest Labs, which provides us with a total mineral assay or nematode test. Biological tests, we use several different labs for Haney analysis, several universities for biological specific tests. Oregon, I believe, is one. And what was the second part of that question, John?
Specific guidance, books, etc., that you can point people to for new farmers in learning how to interpret the data.
The Regen Ag Academy, for sure. William Albrecht is a foundational on soil chemistry. Teaming with mycorrhiza, teaming with biology on the biological side of things. John, you might be better answer that than I.
Got one here.
There you go.
You can see it.
Good one, Kevin.
It's all blurred because of my background, but it's the Ideal Soil Handbook V2 by Michael Estera. And another good one is Science. I'm sorry about my background. That's funny. Science in Agriculture by Arden Anderson is good for a deeper dive. But the Ideal Soil Handbook is a good practical primer.
That would be my highest recommendation as well. Yeah.
I would say on any, there are a lot of labs out there, and you get what you pay for. If a test costs $8 or $12, it will usually have a third or less as much valuable information as a test that costs $30. You shouldn't need to pay much more than that for a chemistry analysis or saturated paste analysis. But you want as many parameters on there as possible. Some peter out after just testing the big three, some organic matter and pH. Others start to include, that's drastic, but there are still universities that I get no usable information from. It's just NPK, pH, and organic matter. Most will include a couple of micronutrients, but we're really looking for that full panel. We want to see down to cobalt and molybdenum and selenium and silicon and those sorts of minerals from a mineral test.
There are still a number of questions here that remain unanswered, but I want to be considerate of everyone's time, both all of the attendees as well as the participants here on the webinar. So we're going to answer a couple more, and then any that we missed or haven't answered yet, we will follow up and be in touch with you after the session is over if we don't get to you. So there's a question here from Jim Williams, I think a very important question. What are some of the safest herbicides to use during a transition period? And I'm assuming, Jim, that your question in the context of transitioning to using no herbicides or perhaps transition to organic or whatever the objective might be. So I'll open that to all of you on the team. What are the types of herbicides that you prefer to see people using as they go through a transition?
Cover crops.
Yes. The first answer, I think, is the answer that we need to all work towards is how do we develop cover crop crop rotation systems and cultural management systems that eliminate the need for herbicides. And the reality is that they require different management, but they are a lot more practical than we often think about or are often told. Many people make it sound very difficult, and they certainly require good management expertise. I don't want to discount that, but it is entirely possible to use cover crops and crop rotations for their herbicidal effect, and that's where we need to go. And that doesn't require a transition. You can do that next year.
We saw that in that field day down here in Texas, John, where we had that AEA side was the weed control was so much better, where the AEA products were used in biology was introduced. We were seeing a lot better control and not having to make that extra applications and stuff like that. So starting there is always the best place to start.
Yeah. We're going to take one last question here, a question from Angelo, which is a really good question. When applying foliar applications, does droplet size and force of impact on the leaves matter with respect to damaging the foliar biome, the biology on the leaf surface? Open that up to anyone.
I'd love to. I love talking about this. It's so first off, think of a droplet of rain, right? I mean, plants are well adapted at accepting a droplet of rain and not crushing themselves. Those are falling at terminal velocity from, miles high. I think it's, wait, I looked it up. It's 10 meters per second, terminal velocity for a medium-sized raindrop.
Nathan?
There's a lot of potential force there. So I think they can take a lot, but yeah, if you're dealing with a very high powered blast sprayer or something, again, we've got just decades of experience of blasting materials onto leaves, and you can tell if you're going too hard, but for the most part, our rigs are within tolerance. So there's that, but more from a mineral perspective. Getting it out there on the leaf is about all you need to do. As soon as you start including biology, an actual foliar inoculant or a compost tea or extract or something where you're trying to have a living microbe make it through the system, different numbers out there, but somewhere below 40 psi at any point that the liquid gets pumped from your tank through the nozzle, you want to keep it below 40 psi because that's about where bacterial bodies start to cave into the pressure, die. So yeah, you do have to watch the pressure, and thankfully one of the best ways to reduce pressure is opening up your droplet size. And from a mineral perspective here, we are getting actual stoma uptake. That mineral is going into the stoma. The plant is drinking it up. And so we want that droplet to stay liquid for long enough that is possible. So we're not looking for a tiny complete coverage under the leaf and on the branches and everything like you would for a contact insecticide or fungicide. We don't want a tiny mist as much as possible. Bigger droplets, lower pressure. But it's not because it's going to damage the leaf. It's just for the uptake and making it worth it.
Nathan, I love you, man. You looked it up. 10 meters per second. You've just validated your nomination as a kook, a keeper of odd knowledge. All right. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you team members for being here and for sharing what you've learned with everyone else. And I look forward to having all of you back on future webinars, which I'm sure is going to happen. To all of our participants, thank you for being here and for staying with us even well past the hour. And if we missed your question, then we will try to follow up and be in touch with you by email after this. So thank you all for being here. I hope you found it useful and practical, and we'll talk to all of you again very soon. Have an awesome day.